It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Natalie laughed as she poured the vintage champagne over Ava's thrifted dress in front of the entire bridal party. The pale gold liquid cascaded down the front of the faded floral polyester, soaking into the fabric and clinging to Ava Sinclair's skin like a cold, sticky second skin. For a heartbeat, the only sound in the manicured rose garden of the Larchmont estate was the rhythmic drip-drip-drop of $300-a-bottle bubbly hitting the flagstone path. "Oh, heavens, Ava," Natalie Sinclair Larchmont said, her voice a high-pitched trill of mock horror that didn't reach her eyes. She tilted the empty crystal flute, watching the last few droplets fall onto her sister's shoulder. "I am so incredibly clumsy. But then again, that rag was practically begging to be retired, wasn't it? It's doing you a favor, really." Aunt Linda let out a sharp, jagged titter from her seat near the stone fountain. She dabbed at her lips with a silk napkin, her eyes dancing with cruel amusement. "Well, you can't blame the girl for trying to fit in, Natalie. It's just a shame that some people are born for silk while others are clearly meant for whatever that material is. Rayon." Ava stood perfectly still. She didn't wipe the liquid from her face. She didn't scream. She simply felt the humid afternoon air turn the champagne tacky on her collarbone. The scent of fermented grapes and expensive yeast filled her nose, clashing with the heavy, cloying fragrance of the surrounding gardenias. Ben Larchmont stepped up beside his fiancé, sliding a possessive arm around Natalie's waist. He looked Ava up and down, his lip curling in a way that suggested he was looking at a stain on an otherwise perfect rug. "Careful, Nat. If the help sees her looking like that, they might hand her a tray and ask her to start circulating the hors d'oeuvres. We wouldn't want the guests getting confused about who actually belongs at this wedding." "Actually, Ben," Natalie said, leaning her head on his shoulder, "that's a wonderful idea. Since Ava couldn't afford to contribute a single cent to the rehearsal dinner, the least she can do is earn her keep. Ava, dear, go find the catering manager. Tell him you're the new seasonal help. Maybe he'll give you a uniform that actually fits." The bridesmaids, a collection of women in identical shades of blush silk, erupted into a chorus of hushed giggles. They looked at Ava's sensible flats and the worn leather bag slung over her shoulder, their judgment as sharp and cold as the diamonds on Natalie's fingers. Ava finally moved. She reached into her bag, her fingers brushing against the cool glass screen of her phone. A haptic buzz vibrated against her palm, a notification from Kara. The acquisition of the Larchmonts' primary creditor had been finalized 10 minutes ago. She pulled her hand back, leaving the phone in the bag. "Not yet." "I'll go clean up," Ava said. Her voice was level, devoid of the trembling wreck Natalie clearly expected. She met her sister's gaze, a gaze that had spent 20 years looking down. "I wouldn't want to ruin the aesthetic of your perfect afternoon." "See that you don't," Natalie snapped, her smile vanishing the moment she realized she hadn't drawn blood. "And for God's sake, stay out of the photos. The photographer is expensive, and I don't want to pay for the extra Photoshop hours it would take to make you look presentable." Ava turned and walked toward the manor house. She could hear them behind her, the clink of fresh glasses being filled, the low murmur of Aunt Linda complaining about the heat, and Ben's booming laugh as he made another joke at her expense. The gravel crunched under her shoes, a harsh, rhythmic sound that echoed the pounding of her heart. Every step away from the garden was a step toward a different reality. She passed a towering marble statue near the veranda, her reflection flickering in the polished stone. She looked exactly like the poor relative they wanted her to be: drenched, dismissed, and diminished. Inside the foyer, the air conditioning hit her like a wall of ice. The smell of floor wax and old money permeated the house. She found a small, secondary bathroom near the cloakroom and locked the door. She didn't look in the mirror. Instead, she pulled out her phone. A single message sat on the screen. "The signatures are verified, Ava. You now hold the debt for Larchmont Holdings. Ben's firm is officially under your umbrella as of 2:00 p.m. How do you want to proceed?" Ava leaned against the cold marble countertop. She thought about the way Natalie had tilted that glass. She thought about the way Ben had looked at her as if she were a bug under a boot. They saw a charity case. They saw a woman who lived in a studio apartment and wore clothes from a bin. They didn't see the woman who had built a $3 billion empire under a series of anonymous holding companies while they were busy spending an inheritance they hadn't earned. Her thumb hovered over the screen. She felt the weight of the last decade, the birthdays Natalie had forgotten, the holidays where she'd been sat at the kids' table well into her 20s, the way they had treated her mother's medical bills like an annoying inconvenience. 2 days, Ava whispered to the empty room. The wedding was in 48 hours. The grand ballroom of the Pier Hotel had been booked. The elite of the city were flying in. Natalie wanted a spectacle. She wanted the world to see her crowning moment as she married into one of the oldest names in the city. Ava tapped out a reply to Kara. Proceed with the audit of Larchmont Holdings immediately. I want a full list of their personal assets used as collateral for the bridal loans. And Kara? Yes, Ava. Make sure Dr. Kim is on the guest list for the ceremony. I want him to see this. Ava tucked the phone back into her bag. She took a deep breath, the scent of the champagne now fading into the background of her resolve. She reached for a hand towel and began to dab at her dress, her movements slow and deliberate. She wasn't cleaning the stain. She was just marking time. When she walked back out into the hallway, her face was a mask of perfect, submissive neutrality. She would play the part for 48 more hours. She would let them laugh. She would let them pour their wine and toss their insults. Because the higher Natalie climbed, the more air there would be beneath her when the floor finally vanished. Ava stepped back out onto the veranda. Natalie was standing by the fountain, gesturing wildly as she directed the florists. She looked like a queen surveying her kingdom. Ava watched her for a long moment, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. Natalie hadn't realized it yet, but she was already standing in the ruins. The countdown had begun. The sunlight in the Oakwood Country Club sunroom was blinding, reflecting off polished silver and bone china with a clinical, unforgiving brightness. The air smelled of expensive jasmine and the faint, metallic tang of chilled spoons hitting sorbet. It was a room designed for people who had never known the weight of a mortgage or the sting of a budget. Ava Sinclair sat at the edge of the circular table, her posture perfect, her expression a mask of quiet neutrality. She wore a simple charcoal sheath dress, high quality, but devoid of the logos Natalie craved. Across from her, Natalie Sinclair Larchmont was the center of a small, adoring orbit consisting of Aunt Linda and 3 prominent club members. Natalie's engagement ring, a 5-carat pear-cut diamond, caught the light with every theatrical gesture she made. It's just so hard to find good help these days, Natalie said, her voice carrying easily to the neighboring tables. She didn't look at her sister, but the tilt of her chin was a direct challenge. The florist actually suggested carnations for the secondary arrangements. Can you imagine? I told him I wouldn't have funeral flowers at a Larchmont wedding. Aunt Linda let out a performative titter. Well, you have to be firm, dear. Some people just don't understand the standards we have to maintain. She glanced at Ava, her eyes scanning the lack of jewelry on her niece's wrists. Not everyone is cut out for this world. Natalie leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with a sudden, sharp intent. Speaking of help, Ava, I've been thinking about your role for the rehearsal dinner tomorrow night. Since you're between things right now, I thought you could be useful. Ava took a slow sip of her iced tea. The condensation on the glass was biting cold against her palm. Useful? Natalie reached beneath her chair and produced a slim, black garment bag, sliding it across the white linen tablecloth. It landed with a soft thud. One of the catering staff dropped out. It's a simple server's uniform. I've already cleared it with the club manager. You can handle the hors d'oeuvres tray, can't you? It would save me the headache of a last-minute hire, and frankly, it's a better fit for your current wardrobe. The table went silent. The club ladies exchanged looks that hovered between pity and amusement. It was a calculated, public demotion, a way to transform a sister into a servant before the town's elite. You want me to serve your guests, Ava said, her voice level. I'm doing you a favor, honey, Natalie smirked, adjusting a stray blonde hair. It'll give you something to do other than hovering in the corners looking drab. Besides, the tips are excellent. Before Ava could respond, a shadow fell over the table. Ben Larchmont leaned down, kissing Natalie's cheek before nodding curtly toward Ava. He looked every bit the arrogant partner of a top-tier firm, his suit tailored to within an inch of its life. Everything settled for the big day. Ben asked, his gaze lingering on the garment bag with a knowing grin. He'd clearly been in on the joke. "Just making sure everyone knows their place, Ben," Natalie chirped. Ben chuckled, pulling out a chair. "Good. I need everything perfect. I just got off the phone with the senior partners. The Sinclair Tech merger is going through on Monday morning. Once that acquisition is finalized, I'm being fast-tracked to senior partner. We're talking a 7-figure buy-in bonus." He looked at Ava, his expression dripping with condescension. "You should be proud, Ava. A company with your last name is finally going to be worth something once my firm takes the reins." Ava felt a vibration in her clutch. She didn't reach for it, but she knew what it was. A secure notification from Kara. "The merger," Ava said softly. "You're very sure about it." Ben laughed, a sharp, barking sound. "It's a done deal. The majority shareholder of Sinclair Global Holdings has already signed off on the intent to sell. We just haven't met the principal yet. Some reclusive tech genius who hides behind a dozen shell companies. But money talks, and we offered enough to make anyone scream." "I'm sure they're very excited," Ava replied. She stood up, leaving the garment bag untouched on the table. "If you'll excuse me, I have a few things to attend to before the rehearsal." "Don't forget the uniform, Ava," Natalie called out as she walked away. 3 o'clock sharp at the service entrance." Ava didn't look back. She walked through the marble lobby and out into the humid afternoon air. Once she was safely inside her modest, 10-year-old sedan, she pulled her phone from her bag. The message from Kara was brief. "The trap is set. Larchmont and Associates just transferred the non-refundable earnest money to the escrow account. $40 million of their operating capital is now in our hands. They think they're buying you. They don't realize they've just handed you the keys to their front door." Ava looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror. The drab sister was gone. In her place was the woman who had built a $3.2 billion empire while Natalie was busy picking out lace patterns. 48 hours. She put the car in gear. Natalie wanted a servant at her rehearsal dinner. Ava decided she would give her exactly what she asked for. She would serve them the truth, and she would make sure every witness in the county was there to taste it. The air inside the climate-controlled server hub was thin and smelled of ozone and expensive cooling fans. Ava Sinclair stood before a wall of blinking blue lights, the hum of a $3 billion empire vibrating through the soles of her sensible, scuffed loafers. This was the heart of Sinclair Apex, a place Natalie didn't even know existed, tucked behind a nondescript facade in the industrial district. Kara stepped out from behind a row of server racks, holding a sleek, encrypted tablet. Her expression was one of professional triumph. She didn't need to speak. She simply turned the screen toward her employer. The escrow confirmation was highlighted in a sharp, clinical green. $40 million. The earnest money for the acquisition of Project Icarus, the proprietary software that Ben Larchmont believed would save his failing firm, had been successfully locked into a non-refundable account. "They signed the embargo clause without even sending it to a secondary legal team," Kara said, her voice echoing in the sterile room. "The Larchmonts are so desperate for the prestige of this merger that they've effectively handed us their entire liquid reserve. If the deal fails on their end, they lose everything." Ava traced the digital signature on the screen. Ben's handwriting was flamboyant, arrogant even in digital ink. "He thinks he's buying a lifeline. He doesn't realize he's buying a noose." She handed the tablet back, her fingers steady. "Keep the pressure on the secondary markets. I want their stock price to feel the leak about their liquidity issues the moment the rehearsal dinner starts." "And the guest list?" Kara asked. "I've already handled it. Every major creditor Ben owes will be at that dinner, thinking they're celebrating his greatest victory." Ava checked her watch. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go be the disappointment of the family." Natalie called. "She has a special task for me at the bridal boutique." 30 minutes later, the smell of ozone was replaced by the cloying, suffocating scent of lilies and expensive French perfume. LeBlanc Bridal was a cathedral of white lace and judgment. Natalie Sinclair Larchmont stood on a circular pedestal, draped in $20,000 of silk, staring at her reflection with the intensity of a general surveying a battlefield. Aunt Linda sat on a velvet sofa nearby, sipping champagne and nodding in rhythmic approval. When Ava walked in, still wearing her oversized sweater and faded jeans, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You're late," Natalie snapped, not turning her head. Her eyes remained fixed on her own reflection. "And you look like you crawled out of a charity bin. Did you even brush your hair?" "The traffic was heavy," Ava said quietly, standing near the door. She felt the weight of the encrypted key in her pocket, a small, heavy piece of metal that represented more wealth than everyone in this room combined. "Excuses are for people who don't have places to be," Aunt Linda chimed in, smoothing her skirt. "Ava, dear, try not to stand so close to the silk. You're practically radiating middle class, and it's wilting the atmosphere." Natalie stepped off the pedestal, the train of her dress hissing against the marble floor like a snake. She walked over to a nearby rack and pulled out a heavy garment bag, tossing it at Ava's feet. The zipper caught on the floor, revealing a flash of scratchy, black-and white polyester. "The catering staff had a cancellation," Natalie said, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. "Since you're so fond of playing the martyr, you're going to help them. This is your uniform for the rehearsal dinner tomorrow. You'll be serving the appetizers. I figured it was the only way to make sure you didn't embarrass me by trying to sit at the head table." Ava looked down at the server's uniform. It was a cheap, humiliating costume designed to make the wearer invisible. "You want me to serve your guests?" "I want you to be useful for once," Natalie hissed, leaning in close. Her perfume was overwhelming, a floral mask for the rot of her personality. "Ben's firm is about to become the most powerful tech partner in the state. We are moving into a different world, Ava, a world you don't belong in. Consider this a front row seat to the life you were too lazy to build for yourself." The door to the boutique swung open, and Ben Larchmont strode in, looking radiant. He was wearing a suit that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, and he was beaming with the unearned confidence of a man who thought he'd just won the lottery. "The wire went through," Ben announced, ignoring Ava entirely as he swept Natalie into a hug. He smelled of expensive bourbon and sweat. "The Project Icarus deal is sealed. $40 million in escrow. The board is ecstatic. We're holding the press release for the rehearsal dinner tomorrow. It's going to be a bloodbath for our competitors." He finally glanced at Ava, his lip curling in a faint expression of pity. "Oh, hello, Ava. Still doing the whatever it is you do." "Don't worry, once the merger is complete, I might be able to find a filing job for you at the firm. Out of family loyalty, of course." "That's very generous of you, Ben," Ava said, her voice as calm as a frozen lake. "I'm sure you'll get exactly what you deserve from that deal." Ben laughed, a loud, braying sound that echoed off the mirrors. "I already have. Tomorrow night, the Larchmont name becomes a dynasty." Ava watched them, the sister who saw her as a servant, the brother-in-law who saw her as a charity case, and the aunt who saw her as a stain on the family rug. They were all standing on a glass floor, admiring the view, completely unaware that she had her hand on the lever that would shatter it. "I'll see you tomorrow night, then," Ava said, picking up the garment bag. She felt the cold texture of the polyester against her skin, a physical reminder of the role they expected her to play. "Don't be late," Natalie called out as Ava walked toward the exit. "And make sure the champagne is chilled. I won't have my big night ruined by incompetent help." Ava stepped out into the humid afternoon air and pulled her phone from her pocket. She sent a 2-word message to Kara, 24 hours. She looked back through the glass window of the boutique. Natalie was back on her pedestal, preening in her white dress. Ben was pouring himself a glass of celebratory champagne. They were toasted to a future that had already been sold out from under them. Ava put the car in gear, a small, sharp smile finally touching her lips. She had the uniform. She had the evidence. And tomorrow, she would serve them a meal they would never forget. The rehearsal dinner at the Sinclair estate smelled of forced elegance and lilies. Natalie Sinclair Larchmont stood at the center of the ballroom, her voice a sharp contrast to the soft string quartet playing in the corner. She gestured toward a stack of silver dessert forks, her eyes landing on Ava with a familiar predatory gleam. "Ava, darling, these are smudged," she said, her voice carrying across the room to the small circle of bridesmaids. "If you're going to play the part of the help tomorrow, you might as well start practicing now. I won't have my guests eating off tarnished silver." Ava Sinclair didn't flinch. She picked up a linen cloth, her movements deliberate and calm. The weight of the silver felt insignificant compared to the digital folder sitting on a secure server in Kara's office. She polished the fork until it shone like a mirror, catching the reflection of Natalie's smug grin. "It's important to see things clearly, Natalie," she said softly. "Sometimes, the things that look the brightest are the most hollow inside." Natalie let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She adjusted her heavy diamond necklace, a gift from Ben, and leaned in close. Her perfume, a cloying scent of rose and musk, felt like a physical weight. "Is that your attempt at a sisterly warning? Save it for someone who cares about your depth. I have the husband, the house, and the wedding of the century. You have a polyester uniform and a tray. Know your place." Aunt Linda chuckled from a nearby velvet armchair, sipping a glass of vintage champagne that cost more than a month's rent. "She's right, Ava. You always were too dramatic for your own good. Just focus on the appetizers tomorrow. Try not to embarrass the family more than you already have." Ava didn't respond to the jab. Instead, she turned her gaze to Ben Larchmont, who was holding court by the fireplace. He looked every bit the successful partner, his chest puffed out as he bragged about his firm's recent expansion. He caught Ava watching him and smirked, walking over with a glass of scotch in hand. "Still here, Ava?" he asked, his voice low and dismissive. "I thought you'd be at the employment office by now. Don't worry, though. Once the wedding is over, I might be able to find a spot for you in the mailroom, if you can handle the filing." "You should check the morning headlines before you offer me a job, Ben," she replied, her voice steady. "Markets can be volatile. Firms that look stable often collapse when the real owner decides to pull the plug." Ben's eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second. He gripped his glass tighter, the ice clinking against the crystal with a sharp, nervous rattle. For a heartbeat, the arrogance wavered. Then he looked at her modest attire and his lip curled. "The real owner? I'm a senior partner. I'm the one who signs the checks. You've spent too much time in the basement, Ava. It's made you delusional." He turned his back on her, dismissing her as easily as a fly. But Dr. Kim, who had been standing near the buffet line, watched the exchange with a keen, silent intensity. She caught Ava's eye and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. She saw the iron in her spine that the others were too blinded by their own vanity to notice. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast long, jagged shadows across the estate, Ava stepped out onto the terrace. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Kara. "The final signature is dry. The Larchmont acquisition is complete. You are now the majority shareholder of the parent company." Ava looked back through the glass doors. Natalie was preening in front of a gilded mirror, adjusting her headband as if she were being crowned. Aunt Linda was laughing at another one of Ben's jokes, her hand resting on his arm in a show of unified status. They were a tableau of unearned confidence, standing on a floor that was already shifting beneath them. The Sinclair estate, with its sweeping staircases and manicured gardens, was supposed to be the prize. Natalie had spent months reminding Ava that she was the only one fit to inherit the family's prestige. She didn't realize that prestige was a currency her sister had already devalued. Ava had given them a chance. She had dropped the hints, offered the warnings, and waited for even a shred of genuine sisterly concern or professional respect. Instead, they had doubled down on their cruelty. She felt the cool evening air on her face, a sharp contrast to the stifling, perfume-heavy heat of the ballroom. She leaned against the stone railing, her fingers tracing the smooth surface of the balustrade. "Be careful what you wish for, Natalie," she whispered to the dark. The countdown had reached its final hours. Tomorrow, the mask would come off, and the Sinclair legacy would finally meet its true heir. She looked at the darkened windows of the guest wing and smiled. The meal was prepared, and she was ready to serve. The scent of 5,000 Casablanca lilies hung heavy in the air of the St. Regis ballroom, a cloying, funeral sweetness that masked the smell of sweat and desperation beneath the designer silk. Natalie Sinclair Larchmont stood at the center of the gilded room, her ivory train sprawling across the marble like a conquering flag. She held a flute of vintage crystal, her laughter ringing out, a sharp, practiced sound that demanded an audience. Beside her, Ben Larchmont preened in a tuxedo that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, his chest puffed out as he accepted congratulations from men who only cared about his new wife's last name. Ava Sinclair watched them from the shadows of a fluted Corinthian column near the back of the hall. She was dressed in the charcoal gray shift Natalie had picked out for her, a garment designed to make her look like a dowdy assistant rather than the maid of honor. The fabric was scratchy and cheap, a final petty jab from a sister who lived for the optics of hierarchy. "Still hiding in the corners, Ava?" The voice was like curdled cream. Aunt Linda swanned over, her neck draped in tiered pearls that looked like a chokehold. She didn't wait for an answer, her eyes scanning Ava's muted outfit with a smirk of pure satisfaction. "It's probably for the best. Natalie looks like a goddess tonight. We wouldn't want you in any of the professional shots looking well like that. It would ruin the Sinclair aesthetic." Ava took a slow sip of sparkling water, her expression a mask of placid indifference. "The aesthetic is certainly consistent, Aunt Linda. Everything is exactly as it seems on the surface." "Don't be snide," the older woman snapped, her voice dropping to a hiss. "You should be grateful your sister even allowed you to be part of the processional after that stunt you pulled with the rehearsal dinner. You've always been the family's heavy lifting, dear. Just try to stay out of the way while the important people talk." The important people were currently surrounding Ben, who was holding court near the cake, a 7-tier monstrosity dripping in gold leaf. Ava moved closer, blending into the flow of servers and socialites. She caught the tail end of Ben's boastful baritone. "It's almost a done deal," Ben said, swirling his scotch. "Etherius Tech is looking for a domestic partner to handle their North American infrastructure. Once the papers are signed, Larchmont Holdings won't just be a player in the market. We'll be the market. I've been in contact with their lead executive's office all week." Ava felt a cold spark of amusement. She knew exactly who Ben had been in contact with. She had read the emails Kara had flagged, the ones where Ben had tried to use the Sinclair name to bypass the standard vetting process, offering incentives that bordered on federal crimes. "I heard the CEO of Etherius is a ghost," one of the investors noted, leaning in. "No one has ever seen the person behind the curtain, just a signature and a lot of zeros." "Power doesn't need to show its face," Ben replied with a wink, his arrogance radiating off him in waves. "It just needs to write the checks, and soon I'll be the one holding the pen." He looked over then, spotting Ava standing near a tray of hors d'oeuvres. His smirk widened, fueled by the 3 scotches he'd downed since the ceremony. "Ah, the little sister. Enjoying the scraps, Ava. Don't worry, once the Etherius deal closes, I might find a desk for you in the filing department." "Family rates, of course." The men around him chuckled. It was a comfortable, cruel sound, the sound of people who believed they were the only ones in the room who mattered. Ava didn't flinch. She reached into the small, beaded clutch at her side and felt the cool, brushed titanium of her phone. A single vibration pulsed against her palm. A text from Kara. "The feed is live. Uplink secured. Standing by for your mark." "I appreciate the offer, Ben," she said, her voice quiet but perfectly steady. "But I think you'll find that the filing department is going to be very busy with internal audits quite soon. You might want to save that desk for yourself." Ben's face darkened, his brows knitting together in a flash of drunken irritation. "You always were a weird kid. Just keep your mouth shut and try not to embarrass Natalie during the toast. This is her night, her legacy." "Oh, I wouldn't dream of missing the toast," she replied. She turned away, her pulse a rhythmic, driving beat in her ears. She navigated the ballroom, passing Dr. Kim, who was seated at a table near the stage. The doctor caught her eye and gave a nearly imperceptible nod, a silent validation of the storm that was about to break. The lights in the ballroom began to dim, a signal for the formal program to begin. Natalie stepped onto the dais, the spotlight catching the diamonds in her hair and turning them into blinding needles of light. She took the microphone from the stand, the feedback giving a short, sharp chirp that silenced the room. "Friends, family, and the people who actually matter," Natalie began, her voice amplified and dripping with the casual elitism she'd refined since childhood. A ripple of sycophantic laughter moved through the crowd. "Tonight isn't just about a wedding. It's about the continuation of a dynasty. The Sinclair name has always stood for excellence, for prestige, and for knowing exactly who belongs at the table and who belongs at the feet of it." Ava stood by the tech booth at the rear of the room. The technician, a young man Kara had handpicked and paid triple the union rate, looked at her with wide eyes. Ava didn't look back. She watched her sister on the stage, basking in the adoration of a room full of people who didn't realize they were about to witness a digital execution. "I want to take a moment," Natalie continued, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on Ava. A cruel, triumphant glint sparked in her gaze. "To acknowledge my sister. Poor, quiet Ava, she's been such a help during this process. She reminds us all that even if you aren't born with the talent or the grace to lead, you can still find a way to be useful. I have a special tribute I've prepared for her, a look back at where she started, compared to where we are now." Natalie gestured to the massive projection screen behind her. This was the moment she had bragged about, a montage of charity photos she'd curated to humiliate Ava, showing her in her most vulnerable, unpolished years. "Go ahead," Ava whispered to the technician. The young man's fingers flew across the keyboard. On stage, Natalie's smile was wide, her hand extended toward the screen, waiting for the first image of her sister's humiliation to appear. The crowd leaned forward, sensing blood in the water, ready to laugh at the expense of the Sinclair runt. The screen flickered, but the images of a young, awkward Ava didn't appear. Instead, the Etherius Tech logo, a minimalist golden phoenix, slashed across the darkness in high-definition brilliance. The ballroom went deathly silent. Ben froze, his scotch glass halfway to his lips. Natalie's hand stayed extended, her mouth still open, but the triumphant words died in her throat. A deep, synthesized chime echoed through the subwoofers, vibrating the floorboards. Then, a line of text began to scroll across the screen, visible to every investor, every socialite, and every member of the Sinclair board. "Unauthorized access detected. LARCHMONT Holdings attempted system breach." Below it, a series of internal emails began to populate the screen. Ben's private correspondence, his desperate pleas for a merger, his offers of bribes, and finally, the response from the Etherius CEO's office, a response that had never been sent to him but was now being broadcast to everyone he had ever tried to impress. Natalie turned, her face pale under the harsh stage lights. "What is this? This isn't the video. Ben, do something." Ben scrambled toward the tech booth, but the security team Ava had hired, men in suits who looked far more capable than the hotel's regular staff, stepped into his path. Ava stepped out from behind the column, walking slowly toward the center of the room. She wasn't the dowdy sister anymore. She stood tall, the cheap fabric of her dress irrelevant against the sheer gravity of her presence. She looked up at her sister on the stage, whose expression was beginning to crumble from confusion into a raw, jagged terror. Ava reached into her clutch and pulled out a small, wireless remote. She pressed the center button. The emails disappeared. In their place, a live video feed from the Etherius boardroom appeared. At the head of the table sat Kara, flanked by a dozen lawyers. "The board is ready for your statement, Miss Sinclair." Kara's voice boomed through the ballroom speakers. Natalie dropped the microphone. The hollow asterisk thud echoed like a gunshot. She stared at Ava, her eyes wide, her chest heaving as the realization began to sink in like a slow-acting poison. Ava didn't say a word. She just waited for the silence to become absolute. The ballroom, usually a place of practiced elegance, felt as though the oxygen had been sucked out of it. On the massive screens where a montage of Natalie's perfect life was supposed to play, a sterile, high-tech boardroom now loomed. The Etherius logo, a stylized golden eagle, glowed behind Kara, who sat at the head of a mahogany table flanked by a phalanx of men in gray suits. Natalie Sinclair Larchmont stood frozen on the stage, the microphone still clutched in a white-knuckled grip. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving behind a sallow, sickly gray that made her expensive foundation look like a mask. Her eyes, usually narrowed with calculated malice, stretched wide until the whites showed all the way around the pupils. Her jaw didn't just drop. It hung loose, her lips trembling as she tried to form a word that wouldn't come. The arrogance that had defined her for 30 years vanished, replaced by a raw, naked terror that made her look small despite the towering heels and the designer lace. She reached out for the podium as if to steady herself, but her hand shook so violently she missed it entirely, her fingers scratching uselessly against the wood. "The board has reviewed the discrepancies, Miss Sinclair." Kara's voice was crisp, echoing off the gilded ceiling with the weight of a gavel. She didn't look at the camera. She looked at the legal folders in front of her. "The Sinclair Trust has been frozen effective immediately. Your sister, the majority shareholder and chairwoman of Etherius, has revoked your discretionary spending privileges and all associated corporate lines of credit." A collective gasp rippled through the 300 guests. Aunt Linda, who had spent the last hour mocking Ava's charity shop aesthetic, suddenly looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. She pulled her chair back, the screech of wood on marble sounding like a dying animal in the unnatural silence. She didn't look at her niece on the stage anymore. She looked at the woman standing in the center of the room with a terrifying, fawning realization. Ben Larchmont stepped forward from the wings of the stage, his face a mask of sweating confusion. "Ava, what is this, chairwoman?" He looked from the screen to his bride, his eyes darting toward the lawyers on the feed. He recognized them. They were the senior partners of his own firm. They weren't looking at him with the usual professional courtesy. They were looking at the woman on the screen with something akin to fear. Ava walked toward the stage. She didn't rush. The sound of her modest heels was steady, a rhythmic ticking clock. She stopped at the base of the stairs, looking up. The smell of the thousands of white lilies decorating the room suddenly felt cloying, like a funeral. "You always said I was a shadow, Natalie," she said, her voice low but carrying perfectly. "You told everyone I was the poor relation you kept around out of pity. You even used my allowance to pay for this absurd cake." She gestured vaguely at the 7-tier monstrosity behind her sister. "But you forgot one thing. I was the one who wrote the checks, and I'm done signing them." Dr. Kim stood near the buffet, a small, knowing smile touching his lips. He caught Ava's eye and gave a single, slow nod. He was the only one in the room who didn't look shocked. He looked vindicated. Natalie finally found her voice, though it was thin and cracked. You can't do this. This is my wedding. You're lying. This is some kind of sick, jealous joke." On the screen, Kara held up a notarized document. "The acquisition of Larchmont and Associates was finalized at 4 o'clock today, Natalie. Etherius is now the parent company." Kara finally looked into the lens, her expression professional and utterly cold. "Which means, technically, Ava is now Ben's employer. And yours." The silence that followed was absolute. Ben's face went from pale to a deep, mottled purple. He looked at Natalie, then at the screen, then back at the woman he had spent the morning insulting. He realized in that moment that the lifestyle he'd been chasing, the prestige of the Sinclair name, wasn't attached to the woman in the white dress. Ava didn't wait for the screaming to start. She didn't wait for her sister to throw a tantrum or for Aunt Linda to start begging for forgiveness. She had seen enough. She reached into her clutch and felt the smooth, cool surface of her phone. One text to the security team outside was all it took. "Enjoy the party, Natalie," she said. She turned her back on the stage, her posture perfect. "But make sure you pack your things tonight. The house in the Hamptons, the penthouse, they're corporate assets now. And I've decided to liquidate." She walked toward the exit, the sea of guests parting for her like she was royalty. She didn't look back as she heard the first sob break from the stage, followed by the frantic shouting of Ben trying to explain himself to the lawyers on the screen. She stepped out into the cool night air, the heavy scent of the lilies finally fading, replaced by the clean, sharp smell of the coming rain. It was over. The heavy glass doors of the estate foyer muffled the chaos behind her, but the vibration of the music still thrummed through the soles of her shoes. Ava Sinclair stood in the center of the marble expanse, her breath hitching only slightly as she pulled the damp air into her lungs. The scent of ozone and wet stone drifted in from the open portico, sharp and cleansing compared to the suffocating lilies inside. She didn't have to wait long. The sound of frantic, uneven footsteps echoed against the high ceilings. The unmistakable rhythm of someone running in designer heels they couldn't quite balance in. Natalie Sinclair Larchmont burst through the doors, her white silk train snagging on the brass hinge with a sickening tear. She didn't care. Her face was a mask of jagged fury, her chest heaving as she pointed a trembling finger at the woman she had spent a lifetime belittling. "You pathetic, jealous bitch," she screamed, her voice cracking as it bounced off the cold stone walls. "You think a few legal threats and a slideshow change anything? You're nothing. You're the charity case of this family, and I will have you sued into the gutter for what you did to my wedding." Ava didn't flinch. She watched her sister with a detached clinical interest, much like one might observe a storm through a reinforced window. She reached into her small, unassuming clutch and pulled out a sleek black smartphone. With a single tap, a notification chimed, not on her phone, but on the tablet held by the venue's catering manager, who was standing frozen by the coat check. "Check the ownership registry, Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice low and steady. The man blinked, his fingers flying across the screen. His eyes went wide as he looked from the device to the woman in the modest navy dress. The payment for the entire gala has been revoked, Mrs. Larchmont, and the venue's liability insurance for this evening has just been canceled by the primary stakeholder." Natalie's face didn't just fall. It seemed to dissolve. The carefully applied waterproof mascara began to track through her foundation like ink on wet parchment. Her jaw hung slack, her lower lip trembling with a rhythmic, uncontrolled twitch that made her look years older. The frantic, darting movement of her eyes stopped, fixing instead on the legal seal on the phone screen with a glazed, hollow stare. The vibrant flush of her anger was replaced by a sickly, gray pallor that started at her throat and crept upward until even her ears were ghostly white. She looked like a statue caught in the middle of a collapse, frozen in the exact second her world turned to dust. "Stakeholder," Natalie whispered, the word barely a breath. "I don't just own the tech Ben's firm uses, Natalie. I own the holding company that leases this estate. I own the venture capital firm that funded your dream wedding," she said, stepping forward until she was inches from her sister's trembling form. "Every cent you spent today was mine, and since you've spent the last 3 hours telling everyone I don't belong here, I've decided to agree with you. I don't belong in a room filled with people who only value me when they think I'm paying the tab." The lobby was no longer empty. Aunt Linda had scurried out, followed by a handful of the more prominent board members and Dr. Kim, who stood near the pillar with a look of quiet, somber pride. "Ava, darling," Aunt Linda started, her voice suddenly dripping with a syrupy, panicked affection. She reached out, her hand fluttering toward her niece's arm. "We didn't mean, you know how weddings are, stressful. Let's all just go back inside, have some champagne, and talk this through like family. We can fix this." Ava stepped back, avoiding the touch as if it were toxic. The sheer audacity of the pivot made her stomach turn. "Family? You laughed when she called me a homeless embarrassment, Linda. You held her veil while she told me to eat with the staff." She turned her gaze to the catering manager. "Mr. Henderson, please escort these people off the property. The event is terminated." "You can't do this." Ben Larchmont appeared in the doorway, his tuxedo jacket discarded, his shirt stained with sweat. He looked at Ava with a mixture of terror and lingering arrogance. "My firm, we have contracts. You're destroying my career." "Your firm has a morality clause in its licensing agreement, Ben. Publicly disparaging the owner of the intellectual property is a breach," she replied, her voice cutting through his panic like a blade. "My lawyers sent the termination notice to your partners 10 minutes ago. You aren't a partner anymore. You're a liability." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a vacuum forming where a life of unearned privilege used to be. The witnesses, The board members who had laughed at Natalie's jokes, the socialites who had whispered about Ava's dress, all began to move. They didn't move toward Natalie to comfort her. They moved toward the exits, their eyes averted, their bodies physically distancing themselves from the social wreckage of the Larchmont name. Kara stepped out from the shadows of the portico, holding a heavy leather briefcase. She handed a single, thick envelope to the head of security. "These are the formal eviction notices for the corporate housing. They have until midnight to remove personal effects." Ava looked at her sister one last time. Natalie was slumped against the marble pillar, her expensive white dress trailing in the dirt and rainwater that had blown in through the door. She looked small. For the first time in 25 years, she looked exactly like the person she had accused Ava of being. "I told you once that I valued your happiness, Natalie," she said, her voice echoing one last time. "But you taught me that you can't value something that's built on someone else's bones. The house is gone. The firm is gone. The Sinclair name, that's mine. Don't use it again." She turned and walked toward the waiting black sedan. Dr. Kim met her at the door, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "Where to, Ava?" he asked softly. She looked back at the grand estate, the lights flickering as the staff began to shut down the power. The rain was coming down in earnest now, washing the scent of the lilies away for good. "To the office, Dr. Kim," she said, stepping into the car. "I have a board meeting at 8, and I think it's time we discuss the new direction of the Sinclair empire." As the car pulled away, she didn't look back at the screaming match breaking out between Ben and Natalie on the curb. She simply closed her eyes and listened to the rain. For the first time in her life, the silence wasn't lonely. It was hers. 6 months later, the view from the 45th floor of the Sinclair Tower still felt like a hard-won secret. Ava Sinclair sat behind the mahogany desk that had once belonged to her father, watching the morning fog roll off the bay. The office didn't smell like the lilies of the old estate or the stale, suffocating perfume of her sister's vanity. It smelled of ozone, fresh-pressed espresso, and the quiet, electric hum of a multi-billion-dollar machine finally running in sync. Kara walked in, her heels clicking softly on the polished slate floors, a sound of efficiency, not ego. She placed a single tablet on the desk, her expression professional yet warmed by a genuine smile. "The Larchmont audit is finalized, Ava. The last of the misappropriated funds have been recovered from Ben's offshore accounts. He officially filed for personal bankruptcy at dawn." Ava didn't feel the surge of triumph she'd expected. Instead, there was a steady, cool pulse of justice. She ran her fingers over the smooth, cold edge of the desk. "And the house? The bank seized it yesterday," Kara said, her voice dropping an octave. "The audacity of it, though Natalie tried to sue the estate for a maintenance allowance last week. Her lawyer actually argued that because she was never taught a trade, you were legally obligated to support her lifestyle." Ava felt a flicker of that old, familiar heat, a rage spike at the sheer entitlement that still curdled in her sister's blood. She still thinks the world owes her a throne for simply existing. "She's about to find out it doesn't even owe her a chair," Kara replied. "She's moved into a one-bedroom apartment in the Heights. It's a 4th-floor walk-up. I believe she's currently looking for work in retail, though her reputation precedes her." "Let her look," Ava said quietly. "She needs to learn the value of a dollar she didn't steal." Later that afternoon, Ava stepped out of the building for a scheduled lunch with Dr. Kim. The city air was crisp, carrying the metallic scent of nearby construction and the bitter aroma of burnt coffee from a street vendor. As she waited for her car, she saw a figure standing near the bus stop across the street. It was Natalie Sinclair Larchmont. The transformation was jarring. Gone were the silk wraps and the designer sunglasses that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. She was wearing a scratchy, ill-fitting wool coat that looked like a bargain bin find. Her hair, once perfectly coiffed by a team of stylists, was pulled back in a messy, flat ponytail. But it was her face that told the real story. The skin beneath her eyes was sallow, and the vibrant, arrogant spark had been replaced by a frantic, darting desperation. She was clutching a paper cup of coffee, her fingernails chipped and unpolished. Natalie spotted her. For a moment, the old fire flared in her eyes, that look of a queen seeing a peasant. She marched across the sidewalk, nearly tripping over a crack in the concrete. "Are you happy now?" Natalie spat, her voice cracking. She smelled of cheap cigarettes and desperation. "Look at me, Ava. I'm living in a place where I can hear my neighbors breathe. I have to take the bus. I had to sell Mom's pearls just to pay the retainer for a lawyer who ended up quitting anyway." Ava looked at her sister, and for the first time in her life, she felt nothing. No anger, no desire to strike back, just a profound, echoing distance. "You didn't sell those pearls to pay a lawyer, Natalie. You sold them because you couldn't imagine a life without a manicurist. You destroyed our family," Natalie shrieked, drawing the attention of several passing executives. The witnesses paused, their eyes darting between the powerful woman in the tailored suit and the haggard woman screaming on the curb. "You took everything. Ben is a ghost, and I have nothing." "I didn't take anything that was yours," Ava said, her voice like a sheet of glass. "I simply stopped paying for the lies you used to build your world. You had 6 months to find a path, and you spent them trying to sue me for the right to remain a bully." Natalie's mouth opened, then closed. Her face collapsed in a way that was almost painful to watch, the realization that her tantrums no longer had the power to move mountains or checkbooks. She looked small, shrunken. "Don't come here again," Ava said, stepping toward the waiting black sedan as Dr. Kim opened the door from the inside. "The Sinclair name represents work, Natalie, not theft. If you want to use it, start earning it." As the car pulled away, Ava looked back through the tinted glass. Natalie was left standing on the sidewalk, a solitary figure dwarfed by the towering glass monuments of the city. "You okay, Ava?" Dr. Kim asked softly, placing a hand on her arm. "I am," she said, though her chest felt heavy. She looked at a small, framed photo in her bag, the only one she'd kept. It was of her and Natalie as children before the greed had taken root, before the Sinclair legacy had become a weapon. She had won. The firm was thriving, the thieves were broke, and her father's name was clean. But as she watched the city's skyline blur, Ava acknowledged the cost. She had saved the empire, but she had buried the last of her family to do it. The silence in the car wasn't lonely, but it was absolute. Justice had been served, cold and uncompromising, leaving her at the very top of a mountain she now climbed alone.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.